Okay, hi, this is Romilly with Golden Circle Designs, and last week we're working on various embroidery stitches. Last week we talked about blanket stitch and how it's often called buttonhole stitch. Traditional buttonhole stitch has a knot, so it's both a looped stitch and a knotted stitch as far as my three developments of needlework stitches go. It's a little weird because it's usually worked over an open and cut area. You can work it as just a plain embroidery stitch though, and it's really pretty. It gives you a little bit more definition than a blanket stitch does. This is the blanket stitch, and it just kind of loops around, and it sometimes can pull itself, if the tension isn't right, can pull itself over itself and get a little funky. You won't have this problem with knotted buttonhole stitch. So I call it knotted buttonhole stitch. It's also called buttonhole stitch. I've also seen it called tailor's buttonhole stitch because it's the one that's actually used for buttonholes, because it gives a nice strong piece. It's also worked upside down from blanket stitch. You can work blanket stitch either direction, up or down, but buttonhole stitch is always worked from the top to the bottom. So the first stitch with the right hand, I'm gonna use this ring, this stripe, so that there's more space to show. You go down and bring it up, straight down. Now, if you were working on a buttonhole, this is the part of the let me get my others. This line here is the part of the buttonhole that would be the hole. So it would be, and it's usually cut before you work the stitch. So the first stitch, you're just going to bring it through. The second stitch is where your knot is going to start. Okay, so your first stitch comes just straight through. Your second stitch, let's see if I can move this over to the other side. Not so easily. Maybe if there we go. Okay. For the second stitch, your first buttonhole stitch is here. Your second stitch comes down right next to it. Again, it's a vertical stitch. It's usually easier with a buttonhole stitch to use the sewing method rather than stabbing, although you can stab. You're going to take this end that was the bottom, and you're going to wrap it around your needle clockwise, and then you're going to wrap it to the bottom as well. So you've made a loop, and again, there's your loop. Goes around. Now that circle, you're going to pull like you normally would. Now see how that loops? You're going to pull this straight up to tighten it. And now your knot is right there. So your next piece, when I do this, I just kind of pull this sideways, and there's my first part, and I'll actually sometimes make my clockwise loop before I make my stitch. And there's my stitch, and I'm going to pull that through. And if I leave it down there, I get a loop. But if I pull it up tight, I get a knot. And that's what I'm doing. So down, so loop, clockwise, oops, down, up. So if you want stitches that go straight up and down, right next to each other, this stitch will make sure that they're evenly spaced. It's a lot easier to make them easily spaced. If you stretch them out, okay, I make a loop, and if I'm stretching it out, working inside that circle. Stretching them out doesn't work as well, although it does still give you that loop. So if I've got another loop, I went around clockwise, and then I'm going down and up in the same spot in a vertical line, and that makes my vertical line. And there's a little knot here and a little knot here. And that's your knotted buttonhole stitch. If you're actually working down, up, if you're actually working a buttonhole, you'll want to make these as close together as possible for strength. So there to there, and then I'm going to take that back piece down and under. This is why I say it's easier for me to make my loops first. So if I make my loop, and then I'm going to go down there and bring it up there. And that is buttonhole stitch. And we'll go over to the left side now. Just move this over here and over to the left. Okay, back with the left hand. Knotted buttonhole stitch is one that I'm not as comfortable with the left hand as I am with my right hand, but we'll see how this works. This is the buttonhole stitch that we've been working with, which is just loops. The knotted buttonhole stitch puts a knot at the bottom of every one of those vertical lines. So we're going to work on this stand here, and the first stitch just goes down. This would be where the hole is on a buttonhole, and if it's worked with a hole, you'd actually cut the hole first. And it comes straight up the length of your stitch. Working left-handed, we're going to work counterclockwise. So with the right hand, we made a loop that went this way. With our left hand, we're going to bring the fat thread around in a loop that goes to the left. So it's going to go over and up, and we're going to go back down in that hole. Well, not in the hole net right next to the hole. And we're going to bring it up here. Now this continues around under the needle and under the needle on that side. That's your first stitch. And that's a little weird, but you make a full circle. And then we pull it through and pull it vertical, so that you get that knot. That tightens the knot. So I'm going to make a counterclockwise. Is that right? So if I'm going to go down, am I still making it clockwise? No, counterclockwise loop. There we go. Down and up. It's easier to make, often to make the loop first, especially if you've got a long length of thread, and then just work inside that loop. For me at least. Pulling it down, that gives me a loop, and now it's a knot. So, counterclockwise, down the bottom. We're going to go down. I'll make a little wider stitch this time. Still coming up at that length. I'm going to pull it straight through. And that gives you a strange loop. But if you pull it up tight, it gives you the telltale little knot that specifies this is a buttonhole stitch. and it's exactly the right width. So your stitches, if you're actually making a buttonhole, will be as tightly packed together as possible to make them very, very strong. If you're just doing embroidery, you can make them as wide as you want. And of course they can be as long or as short. You can vary the length and the height the same way you can with the blanket stitch. So around counterclockwise, down, up. And if you're actually making it this way, stabbing works pretty well because you can just go down and then bring it up in the middle of the loop and then pull straight back. And there's your knot. So down, up. If you don't remember to make that loop first, stabbing doesn't work nearly as well. It's much easier to adapt if you're doing the sewing method, like this. It's, oops, I forgot to make my loop. Well, where does it go? It goes clockwise, counterclockwise this way, and comes up here, I think. Ah, I was right. But if I'd forgotten to make my loop and I'm using a sewing method, by sewing it that way, I can always grab that back piece of the thread and just wrap it around, making it much easier to figure out. This is one of those that sewing really makes a lot more sense than stabbing. But that is the knotted buttonhole stitch, otherwise known as the buttonhole stitch, or the tailor's buttonhole stitch. And have fun playing with it, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.